Well, I think we can get underway. I'd like to welcome everyone to the monthly OPSEI rounds. OPSEI is the Office of Pediatric Surgical Evaluation and Innovation. For anyone who's Zooming in with us for the first time this morning, I'd like to warmly welcome you to our monthly round. And it's really an opportunity for us to meet and discuss important topics, and also importantly to network and stay connected as a Department of Surgery and hospital and university community. So welcome. I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement, and I'd like to recall the words of Professor Kessler from the UBC Department of First Nations and Indigenous Studies, who discusses the importance of recognizing the land history and its caretakers. The Musqueam were inhabitants of this land for thousands of years, on the very land where UBC, our hospital, and the city of Vancouver are located. He mentions as the city of Vancouver and the university grew, the Musqueam history became harder and harder to see. Moreover, as the systems of higher education and universities grew, so many Canadians, so did inequality and oppression of Indigenous peoples who were excluded from educational opportunities and suffered through the residential school system. When we offer a land acknowledgement at UBC, we are acknowledging our past, but we are also acknowledging our current relationship with the Musqueam and other Indigenous communities. Our commitment to Indigenous students to offer curricula which is inclusive and reflective of the interests of Indigenous peoples, and that UBC is an inclusive, safe, and respectful place of learning. We are asked not to make the land acknowledgement a nominal procedure, but rather to keep it fresh and to revisit what it means to us and to consider our truth and reconciliation journey. I'd like to welcome guests who are joining us from across BC, from other Indigenous territory. I'd also like to welcome special guests that are attending this morning, including some guests from the UBC Centre for Excellence in Indigenous Health, the Branch for Global Surgical Care, and the nurse practitioners of BC, and as Dr. Locke mentioned, the Deep Cove Environmental Committee and the social pediatricians. I'd like to also say that this session will be recorded and will be available for viewing later. And at this point, I'd like to introduce our two speakers, Dr. Rashmi Chadha, who is a clinical assistant professor in UBC's Department of Family Practice. She works at VGH on the Complex Pain and Addiction Service and is a senior medical consultant at the college's prescription review program. She is a founding member of Doctors for Planetary Health and an active member of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment and VCH's Green Leader program. Our second panelist is Dr. Doug Kurtamash, who is a clinical professor in UBC's Department of Surgery and is a plastic surgeon at BCCH and a focused clinical practice for craniofacial care and vascular anomalies. He has a wide range of research interests and is involved in social and environmental activism as a member of Doctors for Planetary Health. And at this point, I'd like to graciously hand it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Quillech, good morning. Thank you for inviting us. In addition to recognizing the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh, we'd like to recognize all of the roughly 198 distinct First Nations that make up Indigenous peoples in BC. In many ways, the whole presentation is a bit of a land acknowledgement. And unlike the usual land acknowledgement, this land acknowledgement is for the land with a capital L, representing the earth. And most of us need to change our relationship with the earth and our non-human relations that we share it with. As Don Henley and Glenn Fry said in 1976, there is no more new frontier. We have got to make it here. We have some objectives which were published and distributed, and hopefully we'll try and meet those for you. I want to preface the talk with a few concepts. So there are some things that we all need to exist, to survive, to grow and develop, and to interact. All of our energy is derived from a single source, which is the sun, which is illuminating Carl Sagan's little blue dot Earth as seen from Voyager 1 from 37 billion miles out, which is roughly the orbit of Pluto. That picture was taken in 1990. That's where we live. We need to think about the ebb and flow of the things we need to use in terms of economy. And we usually think of the violent, extractive, exploitive, poisonous economy of capitalism, rather than the circular, reciprocal, indigenous economy that manages precious resources for the future. The word disposable implies there's actually a place where things can be disposed of. When considering climate and social justice, we need a definition of justice, and I really like the work of John Rawls. The rules have to be rules that are acceptable to everyone in the situation, regardless of their position. The people should understand intrinsically how to get along, what the unwritten rules are, and there should be no exploitation, no use of force, and no fraud. In Western society, we understand man's needs and developments as represented in Maslow's hierarchy, which I'm sure you're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy, depicted as a triangle with self-actualization at the top. The history of this is fascinating. So Maslow did his field work in southwestern Alberta and gleaned most of his insights from his time he spent with the Siksika or Blackfoot elders. However, there's actually no triangle in his original paper from 1943, and the pyramid structure is attributed to a man named Charles McDermott, who wrote a paper in 1960 titled "How Money Motivates Men," which is an interesting issue. Further, the article and the pyramid missed the higher concepts of community actualization and cultural perpetuity that the Siksika espouse. Since the culture is based on the land, and the land provides the basic needs, we actually have a circle rather than a pyramid. And this is similar to the traditional medicine wheel based on air, water, earth, and energy, which overlaps quite a bit with our modern biopsychosocial model of healthcare, but also includes the spiritual dimension and the connection to the land, which is what we still seem to be missing. Okay. Sorry, I have trouble with my shift for some reason. Our Western culture has its origins in Judeo-Christian religion and culture, and we have rules to constrain behavior. Our justice is top down. Indigenous teachings are guiding principles of how to live in the world and how to get along. The teachings guide life's decisions and integrate the individual into the whole. Despite a vengeful God, our culture sees itself as dominant over other life on the planet. Indigenous people view humans as the children of the earth and at the bottom of the scale. We still have quite a bit to learn, I think.
Thanks, Doug. Hi, everyone. So the next few slides are going to be talking about the climate and ecological crisis in a nutshell. Some of the next few slides are going to be hard viewing. Thanks, Doug. You can move on as I'll go through them. The debate about whether climate change is over is real, is over. In 2021, we witnessed devastating wildfires, floods, and landslides. The entire community of Lytton here in BC was lost, and 600 souls lost their lives to the heat dome. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, stated last year that it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. This has happened by extreme emissions of greenhouse gases, primarily as carbon dioxide, but also as methane, which we don't hear so much about, which is fracked gas. Thanks, Doug. You can leave it at that slide. GHGs, greenhouse gases, trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere and cause a warming effect. But this is the opposite effect of a warm, fluffy blanket. Instead, it's a progressive rising of the Earth's temperature, which leads to melting glaciers, rising sea levels, melting permafrost, which causes further release of greenhouse gases from CO2 that's trapped there. And unstable climate events, as the preceding slides showed. This has a secondary effect on ecosystems and biodiversity. Everything is hurting. This slide is the climate action tracker. It's produced twice a year. It collates data based on nations' GHG targets and pledges. Sorry, Doug, could you just go back for a second? Thank you. You'll have heard the magic number of 1.5 degrees. This is the ceiling level that we must not exceed for our Earth and everything else on its survival. The lines represent GHG emission levels. So this black line on the left-hand side is the historical line of where our GHG emissions have been going. Green is where we need them to go, so that lower line, in order to stick to 1.5 degrees. As you'll see from the larger double-headed orange arrow, current governmental pledges are going to take us to a 2.1 degree warmer world by the end of this century. Now, none of us are going to be here unless some amazing thing happens then, but our kids will be there, our grandkids will be there, our great-grandchildren will be there. More importantly, if you look at the 2030 pledges that have been made in the last few years, which everyone is loudly touting in the media as being bold, that will actually get us to a 2.4 degree warmer world, which means that those future generations will have to bear the brunt of a current inadequate policy making and will have to make much larger sacrifices in how they live to accommodate. Because to make it clear, as a species, we cannot allow temperatures to get in the mid-2s and up, because this will cause very large geopolitical instability, as most land around the equator will be uninhabitable. Next slide, please. These two graphics show what will happen with a 1.5 degree world, a 2 degree world, and heaven forbid, a 4 degree world. They're pretty self-explanatory, but as you can see from the 4 degree world, which, you know, fingers crossed we're not going to, much of the big central belt becomes uninhabitable or significantly less inhabitable. Next slide, please. And how does this impact human health? Well, as we have rising temperatures, more extreme weather, higher carbon dioxide and rising sea levels, we get an increase in all of these different issues that are contained in the middle circle. And that relates to, and then that causes human health and animal and plant health issues. But for humans, respiratory disease, malnutrition, forced migration, civil conflict. Next slide, please. I've just popped this in. This is from the Climate Central. It's coastal. It has a coastal risk screening tool, which I would suggest you have a look at if you do have time. It shows where projected flood levels are going to be in different years. So there's a way to plug in the year to see where flooding will arise over time when we have extreme weather events. So these areas are not going to be constantly flooded, but over time, when we have big weather events, these areas are going to be at higher risk of flooding. It's quite and obviously, as time goes on with our current, the current way the pledges are being made, the red areas increase across the lower mainland. Next slide, please. Thank you. So who's putting pressure on the planet? We're going to come back to this specific graphic shortly, but for now I'm using it to highlight the points that are made in black there, that 50% of global CO2 emissions are produced by 11% of people, and 33% of the global nitrogen budget is used to produce meat. This is data from the EU. Next slide, please. So the global carbonistas, as Kate Raworth puts it, are the ones who are putting pressure on these outer limits that I just showed you. The graph on the right shows data comparing GHG emissions in 1990 to those in 2015. And this is subcategorized by income bracket. We can see that the poorest 5% over there on the left are creating very little of total emissions, just 6%. Whereas over on the far right, we see that the wealthiest 5% are producing the most, with the richest 10% responsible for 46% of emissions growth between 1990 and 2015. The graph on the left demonstrates that every country has its inequality between lifestyle-related GHG emissions, so the emissions that we produce heating our house, eating, flying, consumption of material objects, and between rich and poor. But it's very noteworthy that after the US, we come an unenviable second. Full disclosure, because I'm very aware that this can sound super preachy, I recognize and identify that I am, as a physician with means and privilege, one of those people in that top percent. And myself, my family, previously made decisions that were not so much thinking about these climate justice issues and how much our contribution was. So I put that in then to highlight that pretty much many of the people on this call, unfortunately, we're all part of the problem. And that's what climate justice is about. It's about recognizing that the cuts that need to be made in GHG emissions need to be top down, needs to be the wealthiest and the people who are creating the most, who are working much, much harder, so that the people in the lower parts of our society in terms of economic income can come up. We'll get more to this shortly. Thanks, Doug. So I'd like to introduce the concept of 9 planetary boundaries and 12 social foundations. We need a more equitable way of viewing our planet and her health systems. The environment and our social foundation are not separate concerns. The 9 planetary boundaries framework was proposed in 2009 by Earth Systems and environmental scientists. According to it, transgressing one or more planetary boundaries may be catastrophic, as it will trigger, in quotes, a non-linear, abrupt environmental change within continental scale to planetary scale systems. These Earth system boundaries mark the safe zone for the planet as long as they are not crossed. As of 2017, which is this graphic, between 3 to 5 boundaries have been crossed, while others are in imminent danger of being crossed. So chemical pollution, particularly plastic pollution, and air pollution. Beyond these boundaries is environmental degradation and reaching of planetary overshoot, which is that arrow at the 2 o'clock position, and its associated tipping points. The white words on the green circle are the 12 dimensions of social foundation, which were identified internationally in the 2015 Sustainable Development Goals. Every human has a right to these 12 elements. Next, please. So the safe and just space for humanity is the donut. It's breakfast round, so I thought a donut is needed. This is Kate Raworth, the economist, very distinguished economist theory that brings in the 12 dimensions of social foundation and 9 planetary boundaries. This concept recognizes that no one should fall short on life's 12 essentials, which our socio-political system does strive to do, albeit not very well. But at the same time, we must ensure that collectively we do not overshoot our pressure on Earth's life-supporting systems, right? Such as stable climate, fertile soils, and a protective ozone layer. Right now, we're outside of the donut on both sides. From a social perspective, many of our fellow humans are not getting their basic needs met. From an environmental perspective, the 9 planetary boundaries are being pushed to their limits. Thanks, Doug. My apologies, I forgot this was my slide. So are we in our zone by talking about these things? You know, we're physicians, we're clinicians, we're nurses, we're administrators. Is this what we should be doing? Well, many medical journals would say yes. I think you can't really look at your subspecialty without seeing different publications in the last 2 years, but particularly accelerated over the last 2 years. In fact, just this month, last month, January, Pediatric and Perinatal Epidemiology did an entire special issue on climate change and its effects on reproductive health. Next slide, please. We are in our lane. A study that was done during COVID in 2020 has shown that physicians do understand the issue of climate change. This was a large study of 4,000 physicians who were surveyed. The majority of the physicians were from Canada through the CMA. As you'll see from the graphic on the left, 65% already acknowledge that illness due to reduced outdoor air quality and physical and mental harm from forest fires or brush fires was ongoing. And for those two categories, 80% of the survey physicians and 77% thought that this was going to get worse with time. It's noteworthy that this study was done during COVID, so this wasn't even the top thing on clinicians' minds. However, they still answered in this way. Next, please. In that same paper, the surveyed physicians were asked what the barriers to engagement were. 54%, unsurprisingly, COVID 2020, said that it was time constraints, but a large 41% cited lack of knowledge. Some felt that there was a futility with respect to engaging the public, that the public would not listen to them because they're not climate scientists. We would disagree. We do have some social license, and our patients do, our patients and public do still listen to what we as clinicians will say, and we only have to look at what the work that the IPPNW did with nuclear war a few decades ago and continues to do to see that we do have a voice. 22% felt there was little support from peers, 16% felt it was too controversial, and 16%, which is not much, and 14% found were worried that engaging with the public could be risky for them. Thanks, Doug. So over to you, Doug.
So the question is, what can I do? Which is what we should all be asking ourselves. And one thing we can do is get our computers to work. There we go. So channel your inner Eckhart Tolle. Don't dwell on the past, that just leads to depression, but learn from the past. And don't worry about the future because that'll just make you anxious, but plan for the future. And live in the present and be mindful and channel your engagement into action. And there's a paradigm which is coming out about micro, meso, macro, and meta levels of action, which span everything from the personal to the international. And as Rajmi's alluded to, this requires a bit of change in perspective and attitude towards climate and justice. Every decision that you make at home, at work, at your institution, and politically really needs to have a climate and ecosystem thought in the equation. And this is difficult. It's not automatic that everyone will just up and change their lifestyle. And it's not just about the cost and the time it takes. It's really a matter of changing your perspective. And just a couple of small examples of things that you see that just came up in the last couple of weeks. So Children's Hospital was handing out plastic wrapped toys to all the children in the lobby by the Starbucks building the other day, just to make them happy. And these are all, fossil fuel plastic wrapped, end up in the landfill things. Vancouver Coastal Health is considering handing out medals to the medical staff for working through COVID, which is probably an unnecessary use of those resources. We almost have an addiction to fossil fuels and plastic, and Rashmi put this really interesting photograph of candied cigarettes, where when you were a kid, it was cool to get your candied cigarettes. And if you look at the package in the middle, it even says doctors recommended, which I guess we wouldn't say that today. So there's lots of personal and household actions you can take. You can eat a plant-heavy diet, minimize or eradicate meat and dairy. The meat industry is responsible for a huge amount of CO2 emissions. Use active transport, like a bicycle, or take transit. Carry your own coffee mug, pack a lunch. Do your laundry in cold water and air dry. Switch to electric for heating and cooking. Be thoughtful about your heating and cooling. Turn your thermostat down in your house. Rewild your yard or plant a garden. Refuse, reduce, reuse, repair, repurpose, recycle, the mantra of the R's. Keep that in mind. And minimize your use of your internal combustion engine and your jet-powered travel. The first year I went to Ethiopia, I did my carbon footprint online for my family. We have 4 kids. We run 1 car only. I had all the gas bills for a year, the hydro bill, and we have gas heating and a gas stove. The family carbon footprint for the year, half of it was my round trip air flight to Addis Ababa and back. It's unbelievable how much it was. At work, you can join or start a green initiative. You can lobby for action, and don't let good ideas flounder and die. We had a recycling champion committee at Children's Hospital, which seems to have faded away, and that could be resurrected. Lobby for better use of green space, divestment from fossil fuel investments, move to renewable energy resources, green maintenance. I'd love to get rid of leaf blowers. And we could consider having officers for planetary health. UBC has launched an environmental initiative with the Planetary Healthcare Lab, which is run by Andrea McNeil, and we could follow in their footsteps like Vancouver Coastal has. This is a great short reference primer from the New England Journal of Medicine. The opening paragraph is a bit scary to me as a burn surgeon, where it talks about the nearby Feather City Hospital was on fire and patients were being urgently transferred to the burn center at the University of California, Davis. I don't think we want to see that happening in British Columbia. And this winter, there have been forest fires in California and Colorado in the middle of the winter. You need to incorporate planetary health actions into your practice, your teaching, your research, your education, and you need to lobby a bit and get political. Every year, this is one example of a disposable item used in the office versus a reusable. And in fact, if you go back and talk to older physicians, you'll find out that a lot of things that are now disposable in medicine used to be reusable in medicine and was done safely. And we need to rethink how we use equipment in our practices. And this is very relevant to surgery. Every year, the Lancet Countdown does a health and climate change policy brief, and this is the one for Canada for 2021. Two of the highlights are eliminating all the direct and indirect fossil fuel subsidies in Canada and removing fossil fuel influence from policymaking. Stand.Earth has a bot which regularly scans the website in Ottawa, which records all the lobbying. And every time the fossil fuel industry lobbies government, it sends a tweet, and it's going continuously every day. There's no such thing for how often medicine is lobbying government about health. You'll hear the terms adaptation and mitigation, and everybody's talking about adaptation to climate. But what we do today to adapt to climate change will mitigate problems tomorrow. So we really think about mitigation and prevention. Over to you, Ashley.
Thank you. I think someone might have their mic on. Anyway. Apologies for sound quality, everyone. 2 years ago, a distinguished group wrote this pledge for planetary health. The reference is here on this slide. I'd encourage everyone to have a look at it. The idea is that clinicians can have a look at this and consider incorporating it into their life. If you could just hang, just back to that slide a second, Doug, sorry. Honestly, you can't get the tech support these days. Anyway, I just include that group of people around a donut just to say that for every decision that's made, whether it be personally, professionally, as a family, institutionally, have the donut in mind. Because if you have that donut in mind, so the 9 planetary health boundaries and the 12 social concepts, you will never step outside that donut, which is the sweet space for humanity, and it's the safe space for humanity. We must incorporate that outside of just dollars and economy and growth. Next slide, please. I really like the Planetary Pledge for Health because it really does draw in on some of the concepts we've talked about related to climate justice. And I think the central one is one of the ones that moves me the most. I'll acknowledge and respect diverse sources of knowledge and knowing regarding individual, community, and planetary health, such as from Indigenous traditional knowledge systems, while challenging attempts at spreading disinformation that can undermine planetary health. There's a concept of two-eyed seeing, where we see with one eye with Indigenous traditional systems in mind, and with the other eye with science in mind. We need to use both eyes to get a full view and a full dimensional view of what the problem is. Thanks, Doug. So this is something we did last year. A few of the people who are sitting around the table with us joined us. We went to Victoria, we stood outside the legislature, and we did a nurses and doctors climate rally. It got a good amount of press. We really enjoyed meeting with politicians, and some of us went into the legislature and were introduced to the entire sitting BC government.
The entire rally that Doctors for Planetary Health staged in Victoria in November is available on Instagram, and I can make the link available to people if they want to watch it. This video is a clip from that I've put together for you, and I think it's really powerful. So I'm just going to let it run on its own for a few minutes here.
Next up is Helen Boyd. Helen is a registered nurse and mental health therapist who is passionately committed to conserving and enriching our planetary health for generations to come. Helen is the BC representative of the Canadian Association of Nurses for the Environment, CANE, and board member of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, so fingers in lots of pies. Ms. Boyd will be speaking to us on how environmental justice is a social justice issue. We're thrilled to have her with us. Please welcome her to the podium.
Good afternoon. As nurses, we advocate for climate justice. The impacts of climate change will not be borne equally or fairly among the rich, the poor, women and men, younger and older generations. Climate justice insists on a shift to a human rights movement with people and communities most at risk to the climate impacts at its heart. The crisis has far-reaching and devastating effects, but how it impacts various communities is not less visible. I want to share with you the impact of how an unpredictable event, such as a flood, has on the lives of those who live marginalized in our society. For a decade of my nursing career, I worked on a mobile clinic that I founded. It delivers healthcare services directly to the streets, to the homeless population of the Comox Valley. Some individuals we cared for were precariously housed in old, dilapidated trailers. A few years back, on a fateful night in early November, the Solon River flooded its banks in the middle of the night. 52 residents living in a campground located in a floodplain had to flee in the middle of the night with water up to their chest. What happens when such extreme weather events occur? In the immediate aftermath, provincial emergency response teams are deployed, and people are given a temporary 3-day housing allowance in a local motel. Food vouchers are issued, and they are greeted with a warm blanket and a hot cup of coffee from a kind and well-intentioned Red Cross volunteer. However, what people don't see is the ensuing aftermath and the unbelievable barriers that exist for this precariously housed population. As a white settler with privilege, it would be easy for me if I was in the situation to obtain help from a family member or friend who would put me up quite willingly till I get back on my feet. But for individuals living in poverty, resources and emotional resilience are limited, and it becomes an even steeper uphill battle. As a nurse, I was there to witness. What about my dog? I just barely made it to the trailer alive. He has this open sore on his paw. I can't afford a vet. Helen, they gave me all these forms to fill out, but the truth of it, I don't know how to read. I'm on an antiretroviral medication, and my doctor says I can't miss a single dose. What can I do? I don't have a car or money for a cab to go to the pharmacy to sort this out. When it was deemed safe to go back to the campground, they wore their recently donated rubber boots and bravely went back to assess their dwellings. Many were devastated at the sight of their belongings drenched and scattered about. A few weeks went by. The trailers were dried out with industrial fans, with the clear expectation for them to return and live in their trailers by the end of November. As a nurse visiting these residents, you could see the black mold on the ceiling of the trailers, worsening their asthma conditions. Although government services were made available, it did not take away the trauma they experienced of fleeing in the middle of the night. Months later, in the spring, laminate flooring was delivered for the purpose of fixing the floors that had been ruined by the flood. I can still see this young man sitting in a lawn chair with his head in his hands and being totally overwhelmed by the task at hand. He didn't know what to do, nor did he have the skill or the tool needed to replace the floor. His hepatitis C sapped all the energy that would be needed to do such a task. This marginalized population contributes the least to our climate emergency. They don't own cars. They don't travel overseas for a holiday. They don't consume many goods. And yet they are some of the ones who suffer the most. Climate injustice occurs when pre-existing poverty and social inequity are additional impediments to their recovery from unexpected losses such as this. Unfortunately, scenarios such as this one will undoubtedly multiply in the years to come. The evolution of climate injustice has its root in extractive economic systems. These systems are a cause of much of our environmental degradation, which climate change is just the headliner. Enmeshed in climate justice are environmental and social justice issues that are inextricably linked.
Next up is Helen Boyd.
So I hope that our presentation has convinced you that climate crisis is also a social crisis, that climate justice is inextricably linked to social justice, As George Manuel, who's the author of the book, The Fourth World, writes, there's politics in everything. I think that this is our lane and there's a roles for physicians in planetary health. We'd like to open up the rounds for discussion. We will hope to leave time for people to ask questions and provide comments and reflect on what we've presented for you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Doug, and thank you very much, Rashmi. What an excellent round, and really appreciate your presentation. To help facilitate discussion, perhaps you could raise your hand or put a comment in the chat. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the interesting presentation. I think the most daunting thing for me as an individual is like, where do I start? So even having those suggestions in the slide that you posted, because we all know what we have to do, but like it's making those little steps of what we can do. And one of the things that does keep me awake at night as the OR manager is kind of how much we're putting in the landfill. And so I do think Doug's idea of kind of restarting a green committee for the hospital really has some merit to it. Once we get through CST, I will have I'll have a talk with my leadership team about it and how maybe we can get that back on track. Thank you, guys.
And I might add to that, Catherine, that you might not have to reinvent the wheel. There is VCH Green Leaders, which I believe that you would have access to, and they have sustainability consultants that may have come in and it's more involved. So you may be able to use their resources to help with making those changes.
Just a couple of comments in the chat room. One from Sabrina Gill from Adolescent Health. I reflect on my youth patients. Eco-anxiety is real. This impacts their mental well-being. And then a comment from Brian Westerberg from Branch for Global Surgical Care. Can you tell us about TMX and D4PH and what they're doing?
Yeah, thanks. I'll speak to that. That's that picture on the left, which someone who's sitting in this audience went to, and it wasn't me or Doug. But as you can see, this is just from the weekend, just gone, where a small group of Doctors for Planetary Health went out to visit the TMX site. So Doctors for Planetary Health is a grassroots group that we formed. There's no fee involved. We just volunteer our time, attend once a week, and we make plans, because what we've learned from environmental activists such as Seth Klein and Sephora Berman is that time is running short. We have 8 years to really make a change to shift that arrow down to the green line. And so every little bit of advocacy that we can do matters. So these micro changes that we make in our lives are important, but it's actually the meso and macro level changes that we make at organizational level and push for at government level that are the things that will keep us at 1.5 degree warming. So on the left hand side is photos taken from this weekend. We'd encourage you, and we can send information, to go visit the TMX site that's now in Burnaby. That picture that you can see the water in the swampy land, that's also from Fortis BC, who are repiping in the same area. Many trees have been felled. This is important natural habitat, including for the western painted turtle. And it's under our eyes that this is being decimated in the name of developing a pipeline, which is going to send us closer to the bad outcomes that we've discussed today. So we all need to be up in arms about this. Our provincial government has not used every tool in the toolbox as it said it would. And we, if every person around this table today, this Zoom table today, went and spoke with their elected representatives, they'd start listening more, because as Doug mentioned, each one of those representatives is having multiple visits from fossil fuel companies on a regular basis. So we all need to stand up and speak out.
And there's just a
So just as a follow-up to that question too, Brian, so what we're waiting for with TMX construction in Burnaby, they have a giant machine which is cutting down trees. And when people stand along the fence outside of the work area, it's considered unsafe for them to cut because of the hazard to the people outside. So you're not trespassing, but they have to stop work. And they will call the RCMP and ask you to move on, but the RCMP come really slowly. This is an area where hummingbirds breed. And as soon as someone spots a hummingbird nest, those hummingbirds are protected, and the Conservation Society will put a stop work order on. And that's what happened last year. So we're just trying to keep them from cutting down the trees until we see a hummingbird nest, and then it'll be shut down.
I just wanted to paraphrase Dr. Blair's comment in the chat room about being successful about lobbying City Hall after 3 years around gas leaf blowers. And finally, a motion was passed to all gas powered lawn and garden equipment effective 2024 will be banned. And just as an example of MISO action.
That's also an interesting topic too, because the science behind the harm caused by leaf blowers has been well known. There's many people have spoken and written about it. And it's not just the exhaust from the gasoline, it's also all the particulate pollution and animal feces and whatever that gets in the air. And why does the city decide they want to wait till 2024? What's wrong with 2022? Anyway.
Thanks, Doug. We have a question from Dr. Natasha Bromeling.
Hi, I wanted to thank everybody, actually. I wanted to thank Damien for a really beautiful land acknowledgement, and then Doug and Rashmi. That was incredible rounds, and I really appreciated, Doug, the way you managed to pull in First Nations economy and ideology into this new circular economy that we're working towards as a way to safeguard our future. And so I just was really impressed and really excited to go out and start ticking more of those boxes. Thank you.
Thanks, Natasha. Any other comments from the floor?
While people are thinking, you may want to screenshot this if you're watching on your computer. This is a potential reading list for you all that Rashmi and I have put together. The Democracy of Suffering by Todd DeFrance, which is there at the bottom, is about how to get your mind around living in the Anthropocene and what to do about it. And it talks a lot about social justice. It also talks about climate change. And Full Circle by Scott Ludlam, who's an Australian author. He was a Green senator in Australia, and he's also been an international Green activist. He's traveled all over the world and worked with various groups. And his book encompasses 3 parallel stories. It's a very good read. One is him living through the brush fires in Southern Australia himself. One is the story of his climate activism and going around over time. And the other is the geological history of the earth and life on it. And the chapters are interspersed, and it's really a very powerful and well-written book. I'd highly recommend that one.
Thanks, Doug. And just for the people that can't see the chat room, I just wanted to read Dr. Locke's comment. As Dr. Dorothy Shaw would say, and she's our former Dean of Equity at UBC, professionalism, including advocacy, come to the top. We are all part of the problem and the solution to mitigate and address the gaps and inequities in the center of the donut as well. Thanking Rashmi and Doug. And then we have a comment from Dr. Sujin Kim from Urology. One of our residents gave a grand round in October in collaboration with Dr. Andrea McNeil on environmental impacts in urology. It was a great talk that focused on operating rooms, current analysis, and what we can do to improve. Perhaps we could have our group as well do a follow-up.
Yeah, thanks, Damien. I would like to add that as our group grows, we have more and more physicians who their comfort zone is speaking within their profession. So Dr. Maura Brown, who I think might be on this call, is a radiologist at BC Cancer Agency. She's been heroically giving rounds whenever she can. We are always willing to share our slides. None of this is, we've made the slides, but we're very happy for others to use them if they're want to come along to some of our meetings, and we can share that information. But essentially, these are rounds that should be included in every department's at different levels. So as Dr. Gill said, speaking about eco-anxiety, you can do an entire talk on eco-anxiety and how to manage it, because part of the problem for many of us humans is it sometimes seems like such an insurmountable problem that one doesn't know where to start. But actually, a lot has been written about the way to move from maladaptive sort of denial about the problem to a more adaptive approach where the problem gets addressed, is to talk about our feelings, recognize them, and then make those changes with action in the best way that we have time and capacity. So and certainly our group, I think Doug would agree with this, that support of having other clinicians or other people who are in your community to just talk to about these things can be so valuable in giving strength to move forward with doing these actions outside of our professional lives and within.
I was recently on a panel with the CMAJ, who's looking at engagement with physicians, and one of the 7 goals of the CMA is net zero healthcare, and that really got a lot of support and was from the people on the panel that I was part of. Kishore, you're next.
Thanks, Doug. I was just going to read comments before Kishore. Can we resuscitate our recycling program in the OR from Dr. White? And I think Kat Lidstone mentioned that. And then Tessa, I can speak from experience from paralyzing eco-anxiety to feeling optimistic and taking action has been a direct result of Doctors for Planetary Health. I encourage all of you and consider getting involved. Over to you, Kishore.
Doug and Rashmi and your colleagues, this is truly amazing. I know that Rashmi reached out a long time ago just to sign a small petition, but to see that this has led to, I think, what you have today, and it's truly inspiring to anyone that's listening. If you really feel strongly about a cause, you can do something. And so congratulations to you. My question is, we use still a lot of plastic in our medical devices, be it braces, little air force that we use and everything else. We're discouraged to reuse them. But at the same time, I was just in Whistler this weekend. Most of the equipment that's given there through pandemic is reused, not for one, multiple people probably in a few days' time. So what can be done? I mean, this is a common practice in the low middle income countries because they have no choice. They can't afford it. They reuse a lot of them. I don't think people have shown them to be any less effective. But we're throwing away braces that probably can be used for 4 or 5 patients because the company says these are single use only because they want you to buy more. So what can be done about those? That how do we bring about a change to bring some of these to be kind of probably sanitized or whatever that they're able to reuse?
Kishore, that's a really great question and a really good reflection. And it would be something with your very important hat on that you could bring to medical companies, to the people who procure for the OR. I would love it if, was it Catherine, if she could speak to that. But this is where we can use our voices for that top-down advocacy. So absolutely, as a department, as a UBC department, you can push for that change. And believe it or not, once you start pushing for that change, other hospitals, other departments across the country will start doing it because they then have some leadership. So the speculum example is one such example. A physician in our group from Interior Health has pushed and pushed and pushed to go back to metal speculums, which I remember using 20 years ago. and that they're now coming back in with appropriate autoclaving and safety. But I remember when plastic ones came in and how much everyone was like, gosh, this is so much easier. It's, you know, just open it and dispose of it. But of course, back then, we didn't realize what the unintended consequence of that use was. So we need to go back. We need to look back to what has been done and what is being done in emerging economies to understand a more sustainable way of doing these things. So I would encourage you to use that voice that you have to access drug companies. They will be having this pushback now from clinicians. There are a lot of clinician groups that are working on sustainability.
Yeah, you know, Tony Cooper saves all of his excellent fixators, which are single use in Canada, which makes no sense. And I've trained in India where we would use them for 10, 15 patients. And I don't think I've ever seen those break as such, those rings. If they break, you replace them back. But here it's so many hospitals just throw them out. And it's such a waste of resources, but more importantly, just adding to everything that you and Doug talked about.
Yeah, you would need the support, I believe, of hospital leadership to do those things. And someone on this call is going to be able to say that, but it would be something that hospital leadership need to include into their sustainability goals if they have them, so that you are supported from a medico-legal perspective, etc. if you're reusing. But it would be such an amazing endeavor to do that. And that these are the excellent ideas that we all need to come up with. And when we're observing them, we need to step forward and advocate for this change. Thanks, Kishore.
Dr. Locke.
My message would be the mantra of person, place, and policy that Barry Zuckerman, our first social pediatrician, talked about around child rights. What can I do as a person, not only in my home, but in my practice? And that was my remark about, you know, working with families who will feel the greatest brunt of climate change, and often are felt to have the least control and least voice, help promote voice. The place, a reminder that in the 90s, it was the secretary of the department head of pediatrics that singularly was a role model, pushing us to get with recycling and not throwing away our paper trash. And Mary, wherever you are, I want to thank you. She was ahead of her time. And administration said, is this really your priority? And we said, yes. And the third is policy. And I invited my city council person who's here today, who's active in this. We have an MLA who is a nurse. Go to the people who have policy. So we'll be going to Susie Plant. Get to know your MLAs, your MPs. We have Hetty Fry on our side. We have other physicians at levels of leadership. So person, place, and policy will be my take-home message for today. So thank you, Rashmi.
Any other questions from the floor? There's a comment from Trish at the bottom. Excellent opportunity to work with ORNAC and AORN to help make positive policy changes that reduce greenhouse gas emissions produced in the operating room. And just above that, there's a couple of comments about BC Cancer Agency Planetary Health Committee, and also Maura mentioned about the University of Victoria School of Public Administration on adapting a planetary health framework. Brian Westerberg also hearkened about the comment about recycling single-use instruments. And Dr. Neil Chadha commented on healthcare produces 4.6% of national greenhouse gas emissions from 2009 to 2015, according to the PLOS medicine. And then Dr. Henkelman, I noticed that the greenhouse gas graph that puts Canada second only to the US is per capita. Planetary health population is also a huge challenge to planetary health. Are there any thoughts about how to address that ongoing concern?
Yeah, that's a really great question, which is an entire talk on its own, I'm afraid. I'm not trying to get out of talking about it, but it actually goes back to the environmental justice question. The idea, absolutely, population does have an effect, But unfortunately, there is, if you'll believe it, something called Eco-Fascism, which is where mainly people from developed economies sort of turn and point the finger at people from emerging economies and say, well, you're just having too many babies. But that ignores the fact that actually we were able to have less babies because we have an affluent society. That means we don't need 6 kids to help us with our everyday living and the farm and whatever we need for sustenance for our family. So it's a super complex issue, and I know that's not at all what is being suggested here, but I just wanted to say that discussion of, well, we need to limit global population, it comes with a lot of complexity that we have to be very careful about foraying into. But eco-fascism is essentially where there is a very extreme group of people who are primarily right-wing in thinking about extreme right-wing in the way they think about the world, who're sort of saying, well, people need to have less babies in India and China. So it's a complex one.
Absolutely. Any other comments from the floor? Well, when I heard about the advocacy work you guys were doing, I just thought what an important opportunity to have you come and speak at OPSEI rounds. And I just want to say, you know, I know that many of us on the call today feel that we're all needing to do something around social issues and things that impact you know, our immediate circle, but the larger circle in our world. And I just have to say, I'm personally so inspired by both of you to kind of continue the work that I do, but I'm sure that others on the call feel the same way, is that I think I leave today's rounds feeling inspired by you and thinking that there's more to do and that there's allies in a common effort to make our world a better place. So I just want to say on behalf of our department, thank you so much for coming. And we'd love to have you back again, and we'd love to hear your progress. And please know that you've got friends in pediatric surgery if you ever need us. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien.
Thanks for the opportunity. Bye, everyone.